The Cuban Missile Crisis, an event that marked the height of Cold War tensions, was arguably based upon the premise of differing ideologies and underlying tensions between two major world powers. During the Cold War, the USSR, or more commonly known as the Soviet Union and the United States, engaged in a tense standoff, primarily over the issue of communism. The United States, a democracy strongly opposed to such a radical government paradigm, staunchly fought the spread of communist ideals, especially in Cuba. Many factors made the United States government adverse to the Communist Party, many of which being American policies. A previously established American policy, the idea that no European influence should be extended on the nations of the Western Hemisphere, was listed in the Monroe Doctrine. Due to the ideals listed in the Monroe Doctrine, the United States wanted to prevent the formation of a socialist state in Cuba. Another motivational aspect was, in contrast, Soviet Russia disliked capitalism. They, due to their fundamental belief system revolving around the idea of codependency and a control factor, believed the American ideal of economic rivalry and freedom was inefficient and unnecessary. Thus, the American public began to grow a dislike of Cuba and the Soviet Union.
We were taught at that age, and we didn't know why, but we were taught that communism was bad. Communists were the enemy. The Soviets were communists, the Chinese were communist, Cubans were becoming communist, and that made them our enemy.
A feeling of mutual distrust also erupted because of the American atomic bomb. America refused to share nuclear secrets and information, making the Soviet Union wary of future American actions. This, most directly, led to the highlighted conflict, the Cuban Missile Crisis. The Cuban Missile Crisis, in the most simple terms, was based off of an underlying tension between the two superpowers in the world, the United States and the Soviet Union. The Socialist Soviet Union asserted a peaceful competition ideal, while the United States' President, John Fitzgerald Kennedy, promised a tough management of Russia, ranging from the space race to the nuclear testing arena. In the nuclear arms arena in particular, there was an imbalance that the Russians felt threatened by, as Americans had missiles stored in Turkey, which, if necessary, could be used against Russia at any time. In part, the Russians wanted to balance the threat of nuclear arms to ensure a more cautious relationship between the two nations. The United States, trying to implement democratic ideals in Cuba, did not support Fidel Castro's empowerment in 1959. To Americans, this transition was threatening to their fundamental ideals because it was so geographically close to the American nation. Merely a year after assuming power, Castro established well-defined ties to the Soviet Union, as they would send Russia sugar in return for machinery, finance, and oil. This ultimately led to many American government officials questioning whether the Cuban integrity had been compromised. Furthermore, the United States itself tried to instigate an anti-Castro Cuban movement. The CIA in April 1961 encouraged anti-Castro exiles to invade the Cuban nation. However, this attempt swiftly failed, inclining the Cubans to ask for weapons to defend their nation. This arguably could have been the main cause of the nuclear weapons tension that developed between the two superpowers, as Cuba would then be armed with the weapons that would cause this great conflict. This failed Bay of Pigs invasion led to a Cuban aversion to any and all American intervention in their personal affairs, as evident in Castro's statement to Khrushchev. Quote, "At the same time, we should take into account the gravity of the fact that, in the current tense situation, incidents can arise by chance. I want to inform you as well that we are generally opposed to the inspection of our territory." The Cuban Missile Crisis officially began on the 14th of October 1962 when an American U-2 spy plane took pictures of a Cuban nuclear missile base in construction. In an attempt to understand the entirety of the missile base, the American government asked what types of missiles were present, in which the Cubans promptly lied, as would be shown in later data. Shocked and threatened by this act, Kennedy's advisors admonished that in 10 days, Cuba would fire missiles at American targets, prompting him to implement a Cuban naval blockade. Fear promptly spread across the entirety of the American nation.
Of course, we practiced duck and cover, but there was another drill that I recall where we kids lined up outside of school and parents would drive to the school. And we never actually got into a car, but the idea was that we would get into a car, any car, a random car with a parent, and they would drive us away from Fort Worth and Carswell Air Force Base to some safe spot. It's an indication of how seriously our adults around us took this situation, that they were willing to risk us getting into cars and just driving away rather than leave us there to be blown up by a Soviet missile.
From the beginning of the Cuban Missile Crisis to the end, the conflict lasted a total of 13 days of tension and uncomfortable fear. With tensions increasing between the Cuban, Russian, and American governments, Kennedy had to quickly decide a course of action against the concerning possibility of a coalition between Russia and Cuba, which would pose a possible risk of an attack on the United States. In contrast, the Soviet Union blamed the conflict on the American act of overstepping national boundaries. Kennedy's first attempt to compromise was to communicate with the Kremlin in an attempt to force the Soviets to end the crisis on their own initiative. In a series of letters to Kennedy following American threats to take action on the matter, Khrushchev scathingly expressed frustration at American interference in Soviet-Cuban relations. From the Soviet perspective, the American government grossly violated the United Nations Charter and formed a path of aggressive actions, both against Cuba and against the Soviet Union. When Kennedy found that his more passive approach would not work, Kennedy used the Monroe Doctrine as a precaution to take the offensive and issue a blockade against Cuba. The failure of Kennedy's blockade due to Khrushchev's continually hostile reception to Kennedy's proclamation, permittance for the Cuba-bound Soviet ships to proceed, and continued work on Cuban missile sites prompted the American government to decide that the most effective course of action may have been to directly attack Cuba. But as that would take more manpower and resources than were available, the crisis had become gridlocked. In a surprising turn of events, after the American initiative had become concerningly impeded at every turn by the Kremlin and Cuban forces, Khrushchev had initiated contact with the White House and agreed to Kennedy's heat of warning, promising that missiles in Cuba would be returned back to the Soviet Union, as well as the immediate stop of further missile work in Cuba. This was in exchange for the United States removing its missiles from Turkey. After the crisis of a threat of possible nuclear war had been avoided, the two governments came together to form lasting measures to ensure that there wouldn't be a future threat of nuclear war. As a follow-up to the Cuban Missile Crisis, the Limited Test Ban Treaty was issued a year later in order to form a coalition between the United States, Great Britain, and the Soviet Union in order to prevent all of the nations who signed from firing their nuclear weapons. The US-Soviet Hotline Agreement, which formed a direct line of communications between the United States and the Soviet Union, also further ensured a way to avoid a miscommunication, especially in the context of deploying something as deadly as nuclear weapons. As a whole, the Cuban Missile Crisis encompassed the differing ideologies between two world powers and the rise of nuclear warfare. The Cuban Missile Crisis proved to be an important step toward being able to manage disparate political ideologies and nuclear warfare in a more diplomatic manner. Today, with increasing tensions revolving around threats of atomic power in countries such as Russia and North Korea, the Cuban Missile Crisis's lingering fear resonates and serves as a warning, for now, against engaging in worldwide destruction through nuclear warfare.